All right, I'm Kevin Libwitt, joined by Andrew Page. We're from Theogen, and this is the Bioinformatics Lab podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking about how to get started with AI in your bioinformatics routine. We've had a couple of podcasts now talking about the benefits and also the challenges with AI integration in our field. And today, we're just going to be focusing on how one would get started, kind of just a conversation of what is the AI starter kit for a bioinformatician, and how you can start making use of these different technologies in general.
Yeah, so I guess the very first thing to do is, you're a bioinformatician and you've been coding away normally, and then you hear about this and you think, oh, great. Or either you're mildly panicked because you'll lose your job, or you think this is amazing. And I'm definitely in this is the amazing camp. But,
Yes.
you got to start somewhere. And probably the very first thing I would do is just sign up to ChatGPT on OpenAI. And then the second thing I do is pay for a premium or plus or whatever they call it, which is only like $20 a month. It's not much at all. It's not available in every country, unfortunately, but that gives you like the higher quality model, which is GPT-4. The other thing to try it is actually Claude, which is free at the moment, which is from Anthropic, who, similar guys who were in OpenAI, but they split off. And yeah, so that's step one. But then you're left with a prompt, just a text box to fill in. What do you do? How do you solve any bioinformatics problems? Well, what I've found is sometimes you just throw data in there and then it magically does stuff with it.
And it's so surprisingly intuitive to use. And I think that speaks to, again, that kind of wild stat. It is at this point likely out of date. I think 2 weeks ago, you mentioned like a quarter of humanity had already tried or interacted with these kinds of technologies and applications specifically. And that speaks to just a low barrier to access these things. I could teach anybody how to use this because you're just communicating with it with natural language. And even as you said, like in terms of the starter kit, at base, a lot of these are free, right? You can use GPT 3.5, and I think maybe you're limited or in some way throttled with your queries and response. But then 20 quid a month or $20 for the American listeners. And you have unthrottled access for prompts and queries, and then you get the plugins to play with at any point. So even if you're starting with a zero budget and you just kind of want to get your toes wet in the field, you could just go register for both sites, both Claude and GPT, and then your interface with this prompt that becomes immediately useful. And then you could start, as you said, asking questions or putting prompts together and trying to solve these bioinformatics questions. And I think even at the start and how I'm using it daily, maybe there's like a couple of categories of how I'm addressing bioinformatics questions that, again, are so frictionless that anyone could start using it today. Like just general questions about algorithms. I would definitely maybe err towards the really well documented and sort of legacy algorithms. If you're looking at like alignment or if you want to look at local versus global alignment, I'd imagine you'd be able to work into GPT and say, like, explain to me, like, I'm 10 years old, the difference between a local and global alignment and where these applications could be. Something like that, where there's a ton of literature, well documented. I'd imagine there is lower probability of crazy hallucinations in something that kind of straightforward, or at least it'll get you into the ballpark of language that's going to be relatively accurate for you to start using. Does that sound fair on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. And like an example I had from the other day is that I had a few different names of species, bacterial species, and I just said, what do these have in common? So I was looking at metagenomic data and I was like, well, I don't know every species there. I don't know every commensal pathogen out there. So I threw them all in and I was like, oh yeah, these are all gram-negative, or they're all anaerobic, or they're all whatever. And that's just a really nice way, a quick way of just kind of pointing in the right direction. And then you can start asking questions, what are they involved in? Are they beneficial? Are they not? What mechanisms are they commonly associated with? And that can really solve, well, they could reduce your workload massively when it comes to actual data analysis. And so it's really handy. Something though that's come out just in the last few days is a ChatGPT app for your phone.
Mm.
And of course, on your phone, you've got like you can do voice typing, so you can just talk to your phone like a Star Trek tricorder into ChatGPT app, and then it'll go away and it'll get you the answers and results. It's like phenomenally useful.
Yeah. And I'm sure we're not too far away from then the vocal response back, right? Because right now it's just text to text there, and it's like translating our vocals to text so that you can have that interface. But soon it's going to be like, hey, GPT, here's my question about bioinformatics, and then you're having the conversation, and then we're all sort of lunged into the world of her in the movie of like AI relationships with your sort of Professor GPT that's been
Oh
trained on
God.
bioinformatics algorithms there.
Yeah, I guess Alexa and stuff like that have had this kind of thing for years, but this is like,
Yeah.
a whole new level. Um, but yeah, I just to warn you, like ChatGPT doesn't allow, like love bots or anything like that. That's something they ban.
Yeah, fair,
So
fair.
you,
Okay.
you can't have an AI girlfriend.
So that's fair. That's a good disclaimer to put out for folks if this is not the podcast for those discussions. But going into the starter kit, so now you're at that interface. Like I said, I think the first sort of testing the waters is just asking about bioinformatics questions, and like for a student learning these things, I could see that being invaluable to just have this sort of chatbot to work through these ideas of like I said, well defined algorithms that you are starting to integrate into your use case or into your practice as a student or a bioinformatics practitioner, kind of just earlier into the career. And then I would say where I'm using it more is on the code, helping in the programming itself, either generating code, as we kind of spoke about a little bit in our last episode, but even translating things. Like when I
Mm.
came into the bioinformatics space, I learned Python first, for an example. But then there's a lot of code out there that's written in Perl, and it always takes me a little bit of time to figure out what the heck is happening in the Perl code. But now with GPT, I could literally copy and paste blocks of code and say, GPT, walk me through what the heck is happening here. And then it can walk me through line by line. Hey, actually, this function is happening,
Yep.
doing this. This is being saved to this variable, and this is how it's being manipulated. And so I don't even necessarily need to learn Perl. I could just throw that in there and have it read back to me in human readable language what's happening programmatically.
You do need to learn Perl because it is the best language ever. So
You come from that era of the Perl era. But I
yes.
came into the Python. It feels that much more human readable and maintained to me. But those is it the Perl modules and the is it Pram is
Yeah,
where
yeah.
they're stored. Those always got me into loops. Yeah. So whatever it was,
I can't
but those
remember.
Perl dependencies always hurt me. And that took me away from the language. But yeah, now I don't have to learn Perl.
So what I found useful actually is for architecting software. So I wanted to build a web app in Python. I haven't done it in years. Previously I used Django like 12 years ago or something like that. And I didn't know what are the most appropriate libraries and frameworks for building an application for my needs. And so I told ChatGPT what I needed. It was like I need like a web app, which takes in basically has a REST API and just produces not just HTML, but all other formats like PDFs and this kind of stuff. So, I gave it the list and I said I wanted model view controller language or a model view controller design pattern. And then it went away and it said, okay, well, actually, you need these different things, and it gave me like the 3 major libraries I needed. And I hadn't used any of those before, but actually they're really useful because it's pointed me exactly in the right direction that other people, have solved the same problems in this way. And I didn't have to kind of make mistakes first or, spend days researching how should I actually do it fundamentally.
That's another perfect example of where like there's a body of work with some defined best practices, and no one person has all these kind of running through their mind, but then you get to use this interface to just interact and get that feedback and put that on display as quickly as possible of like what are already kind of really well-defined ways to approach this problem, and what are even the tools and libraries to implement to do it. So it works in that guiding force. And yeah, I guess the framework I'm using in my head to describe ChatGPT to people, it's kind of like the 200, 300 level university courses. Like it's going to do solid at that level. Like those like
Yeah.
sort of undergrad courses, it's like it's got that body of knowledge really well defined, and it's again low probability of trying to making things up just because there's so much content to describe that, and those best practices are defined. Once you start to get to maybe your more esoteric or niche fields, where there's limited research and they, maybe it's almost working on conjecture, and you see it kind of making things up whenever it's like there's sparse information about it. So that's where the risks are of things. Whenever it's like really specific use case of tools and libraries may not be where you want to start using and implementing AI and bioinformatics in using your tools. Whereas if you're maybe building something at the scratch and you just want to see what are the base building blocks I can be using, I think that's a perfect place to start using these kinds of resources in your bioinformatics development.
But one really important thing is actually having a good prompt to begin with, to ask these questions and to actually extract out the data. And so what I've found is that if you have a poor prompt or you don't use kind of natural English people would normally use, then actually you get poor results out, or not as good results. So, like a normal conversation, I'd say, please, can you help me with this? And thank you very much. All this kind of stuff.
Yes.
And it's been trained on these bodies of language, which, have all of these niceties and whatever. And so it is important to put them in. And studies have shown that you do get better results out if you're nice to your ChatGPT. Just phenomenal, actually. And you get better results if you ask it to think about it. And so maybe the second pass gives you better results, or even get it to rewrite your prompt even better. But what I found is, it's good to give it context, and give it hints about what you're working on. So it's good to tell it you're working, say, in microbial bioinformatics or microbial genomics, to give it some context and to tell it, the kind of the place where you're coming from, because then it knows what type of answers to give you at the other end, and also to give it a voice as well. You can tell it that I know you're a scientist, and so you want it from that direction. And of course, you need to give it enough data, then actual meaningful data, if you want, say, to start off. And it can take a few iterations, but actually, because it remembers everything in the chat, you can build it up gradually. Although I've found sometimes if you build it up, it can sometimes forget the stuff at the beginning. And so you have to sometimes re-prompt it, particularly if you're using the API. So, which is what I use sometimes for coding scripts. And actually, the API now allows you to do ChatGPT 4 with a much bigger prompt size, or context window, so more tokens, more stuff you can shove in, which is really cool, actually. Because previously you could only use 3.5, which is faster, but it wasn't as good, and all these kind of trade-offs. So anyway, I would strongly advise people to play around with it and see what makes a good prompt for them.
I think that's a big point too, because knowing what a good prompt is and kind of anticipating the response types is kind of the important skill to learn here. And yeah, it's almost like learning how a person's going to respond to you. Like, I know it's obvious. My mind is so quick to anthropomorphize what the heck I'm speaking to, especially because you're using natural language, but that is how I'm looking at it, because it's a good access point there too, is just trying to use GPT for general writing, not even the code stuff yet, or maybe not yet the hard research questions maybe that we spoke about, but I've found that it's really helpful for templating written communication. Scientific writing, obviously, you can speak to that pretty in depthly there, but I think sometimes that's often a barrier, is when you're kind of staring at a blank screen and you just have ideas in your head. What's wild about GPT is like you throw those ideas out in even this chaotic order of bullet points, and you say something like, hey, help me rephrase this or structure this in the format of a scientific communication. And it'll plot that out for you in paragraph form and string the narrative together to a great starting degree, or great starting point, where then you would put the manual edits on top of things. So even just in the written communication, not only scientific, I would even say just like, I use it sometimes when I'm putting emails together, like, hey, can you help me rephrase this to make sure I'm getting my points across really well? Like, I'm almost always have GPT on just to, help me correct my language, make it effective communication. And that's a good place to figure out how are prompts being written. How can I add language or add context when it's necessary to get the kind of response that's like most valuable for whatever the use case is there.
I particularly like when you have a list of bullet points and you say, reorder these. Maybe there are topics you want to discuss, and it goes away, and it puts them in a much more sensible order. You don't have to engage your brain then. It's like, oh yeah, that looks about right. Um, but yeah, like a good prompt is the key to it, and you have to think about it like talking to a child. If you ask, I know your kids are too young, but for my kids,
Yeah,
I ask them when they've come home from school, what you do at school today? Nothing. And so you have to ask the right questions. So you say, oh, well, did you do maths? Who did you sit beside? Did you play with so and so at lunchtime?
yeah.
What did you have for lunch? And you have to kind of start teasing it out, and then you get all the information. But if you just ask, something bland and generic, you don't get anything out.
Mhm.
So yeah, you got to ask the right questions.
And specify the context along the way. I think that's a pretty good way to look at it. Yeah, just you're providing all the context. So it will try to fill in a lot of the blocks, as we said in previous episodes. But if you're really trying to use it for high value stuff, or get or responses that are going to be worth the while, I think adding some context to the conversation. It doesn't need to be crazy, but just some sort of barriers so that it can know which ballpark to play in when it's giving
Yeah.
its response. And you can also have that iterative, like, okay, make this more formal, make this more less formal, and it'll sort of iterate upon that for sure.
And you definitely have to, as a mathematician, you do have to get started with this stuff. If you don't, well, then your job may be at risk, because it makes it easier for many people who are, let's say, power users of Excel to do, one level up and do a bit more
Mm.
data analysis and do a bit more, kind of pulling stuff out. And so you have to, up your game as well by using it to, do even better methods and even more powerful code and whatever. And if you don't, well, then you run the risk of just being, obsolete, to be honest, a
I think
Luddite.
so. Because it really is becoming so quickly becoming such a valuable skill that is transitioning into a necessary skill of how to use these resources. And this is a really good just starter kit. Like maybe in a future episode, we could talk about maybe the more technical repositories of like the auto GPT and things like this. But I think just getting the exposure to these tools to start to figure out how they work and how to interface with them is so critical, and it's so valuable. It's not like, oh, you got to like
Yeah.
trudge through these materials. You're going to see the value in it pretty straightforwardly as soon as you start interacting with these tools.
So the first thing you need to do is, pay ChatGPT $20 a month, and you get, ChatGPT 4, and you get Code Interpreter, which is, can do data analysis for you. And also then pay GitHub, or if you're a student, it's free, um, for Copilot and Copilot Chat. Because if you're doing any coding, you're absolutely going to need this. And interestingly, Stack Overflow, which I've used for years, as a place for getting blocks of code, has had a massive drop in traffic. And it seems to be a lot of this is down to ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot, where you no longer need to go and do a Google search. You're kind of searching from within the Copilot. It's generating the code you need, and then without you having to go to an external site. So it's changing the way the internet is working.
And I know we've talked about it a little bit on previous episodes, but can you maybe describe just briefly Copilot and how it differs from GPT and how it maybe is related, obviously, to the Microsoft universe there? The web app versus the Copilot in VS Code.
Yeah, when you said universe, I thought, oh yeah, Marvel universe. So it runs GPT-4 as far as I know, and this is the first thing that people were using in our field. Basically, Copilot, it would look at all the code at GitHub, all the open source stuff, and it would be able to write or give you prompts for code. And so the easiest way to use it is actually say you've got a blank class, just a blank file, and at the top you just put some comments about what you want it to do. This is what you should be doing anyway. You should be commenting your code and saying, this is a class that does, I don't know, holds a gene, and then a gene metadata, and then it does these things to gene. And then you put that context there, and then that means that it knows what you want to put in the file. And as you start typing, it starts, generating all of the kind of code. And a lot of code that you type is actually boilerplate. It's mundane. The actual hard bit is architecting the whole thing and kind of saying, well, I want this bit here, this bit here, this is how I want them to work. But you have to, actually do a lot of keyboard bashing along the way. And it reduces that level of input that you need to do. And it can even guess, you've typed in this variable name and set it here, and well, maybe you want to do the next one, the next one, the next one, and it's very good at kind of putting these things together. So it'll save you a lot of typing and of course a lot of time as a result. And also then you can ask it to make tests, and you can ask it to document itself. So it's kind of, makes you a powerful, very, very powerful coder, and does knock off a lot of time. But you also have a chat interface within, say, VS Code, just like ChatGPT on the web. And you can type in anything. I use it a lot for, I don't know, I get an error in the command line, I copy and paste it in, and it just magically tells me what's wrong, and it knows which files I've got open and looking at, and so it can suggest things within context.
And so like the continuing theme I'm hearing from this thing is it's just such a time machine, right? Because like I could see how, or we all like know the experience of like trying to staring at the blank terminal there, or whatever your IDE, and trying to figure out how do I code this idea in my head. And we would have kind of gone the route of going through Google, figuring out how other people have done it, looking at Stack Overflow, trying to figure out the comments, which is the most appropriate code block template from, and how can I best understand it, which may have taken hours. And then you go through that iteration cycle of building it, trying to test it out, giving it use cases, whole 9 yards. Whereas now that just all gets, what was once maybe weeks of work and weeks of research and trying to find those ideas is condensed down into minutes of, and that being a product and a factor of how well can I just articulate this in natural language of what I want. So the skill of, like, as you said, of orchestrating or architecting what you're building is still required. So you still need to have the vision and understanding of what you're doing, but the time to product, or the time to functional software, is just cut down dramatically. And so that is why it becomes such a required tool in everyone's arsenal, is because the efficiency is just unmatched.
Absolutely. But I guess one thing you do need to be aware of is sometimes the results can be too good, particularly if you train your own models. Because what you find sometimes is people mix up training and testing data sets, and they suddenly, their testing data set gives it back 100%, accuracy, and it's like, oh, this is amazing, and when actually they've just made a fundamental error. So while there is a lot of models out there, you got to be very careful which ones you use, because you don't necessarily know how well they've been trained. And if the people, because the barrier to entry is so low now, the people behind them, you need to trust what they've done is actually correct, and have appropriate training sets as well, which are different to the testing data sets. And a classic example from our field is I reviewed a paper which was looking at imputing SNPs in the human genome. And so they'd gone and excluded sets of genomes and said, okay, these are our testing data set, and we won't have those, and we'll look at what the recall is like. And they get 100%. And the reason was because these sets of genomes they excluded, they were actually trios, so mother, father, baby. And so they removed the baby, but not the mother and the father, and they were still in the original training set. And so effectively the same data was there. And because they had fundamentally misunderstood the data set they're working with, and then they got impossibly high accuracy rates for recall, which is not actually real. And so when you see very high rates, it's they've been an error.
And that's always been this, or at least my understanding of machine learning problem, is like the testing data sets and training data sets of how these things are built, and like sort of over optimizing or removing critical assumptions and an understanding of the data, so that it kind of gets you turning left quickly there. But my understanding though is like, whenever you're just at the starter kit level, when you're using things like GPT, Claude, and then Copilot, you might not even really be interfacing with these problems immediately, right? Because you're just using the models that are pretty well trained and curated for just general use cases with GPT and Claude in the natural language conversation, and then Copilot in the programming. So when would people start needing to put their be attentive to this conversation of the training data set and this conversation about, egregiously high accurate recall there.
Yeah, I guess actually there's an article in the paper just today
Ah,
on AI for looking at breast cancer mammograms. And so, phenomenally useful, and it's obviously in the medical field. And they found that actually they trained special models, and the models were better than having two humans, expert consultants, actually look at this stuff. So it's actually, which is phenomenal, because if you can have that double check there, then either reduces workload for the clinicians, or it catches cases that maybe they've missed. And of course, the positive outcomes from that are you catch cancer earlier, you can treat it, and obviously everyone wins in that case. So that's kind of where you need a specialist large language, or not a large language model, but a specialist neural network
mm,
for this kind of image processing. And you might need more specialist ones, maybe if you're training on your own internal company data.
mm.
But in that case, it's usually better to build upon what is already there. So you can take these existing open source models and put some stuff on top, or Amazon are providing services where you can, again, do something similar. Because you don't reinvent the wheel,
Yeah.
it's a lot of electricity, a lot of money to retrain things from scratch, and probably won't be any better than just taking something existing and then adding a bit on top.
And that sounds like it's going to be its own sort of thread of conversation of training your own models, and even the resources that are currently available to folks where they want to start using that more advanced use case. So I think that summarizes pretty well in terms of a starter kit, places to kind of begin the journey of AI integration to bioinformatics practices. I threw that question out to my small Twitter following there and didn't get much response, because I think once you get, in terms of a starter kit, once you have GPT and Claude in terms of the text interface, and then you have something like Copilot, that's a pretty strong starting point to integrate these tools for your bioinformatics practices. I don't know if there's anything else in that framework and then the context of all the things we're talking about in terms of its limitations and prompt writing and things like that. And then you're kind of off to the races.
Absolutely, yeah. Anyway, will we leave it there, and we'll come on to all those topics next time?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. I think that's good. So we'll see everyone in the next one.